Hello everyone. If you love heartwarming animal stories and want to follow the inspiring journey of these adorable friends, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, let's dive into today's emotional story. It was an unusually quiet evening at St. Anne's General Hospital, nestled in a sleepy town where little ever happened. The calm, almost surreal stillness of the night was only broken by the occasional footstep of a nurse walking the empty halls. Most of the staff were sitting in the break room, exchanging stories or monitoring the lone patient in the emergency room. The air seemed almost static, until the unexpected happened. The automatic doors of the hospital entrance slid open with a soft mechanical hum. But instead of a visitor or staff member, a dirty dog stumbled through the doorway, its legs unsteady and its fur matted with mud. The nurses froze, wide-eyed, as they watched the animal carefully approach the entrance. It was a large dog, his paws raw and battered, his body exhausted as though it had traveled miles through harsh terrain. But what caused the nurses to gasp in unison was not just the dog's condition. It was what he was carrying. The animal held something in its mouth, something wrapped in an old, frayed blanket. It was unmistakable. The head nurse, Sarah, was the first to react. Her eyes widened as she stepped forward cautiously. "Is that?" she whispered, but she could barely form the words. The dog, almost human-like in his patience, gently set the bundle down in front of her, then backed away. It did not bark. It did not whimper. It simply stood, gazing at the nurses with an intensity that spoke volumes. With trembling hands, Sarah slowly unwrapped the cloth. Her heart stopped. There, lying motionless and eerily silent, was a baby. No older than a few months, the child appeared pale, its tiny chest rising and falling with great difficulty. His body was covered in dirt, his skin too cold, and his lips were faintly blue. A fragile, broken breath escaped the baby's lips as if each breath required a fight. It was clear to Sarah, this baby had been left to die, but somehow, this dog had brought him to safety. "Oh my God," Sarah gasped, her voice shaky. "It's a baby." The moment she spoke those words, the gravity of the situation hit. The emergency room suddenly erupted into action. Nurses rushed forward, grabbing monitors, IVs, and oxygen, working as quickly as possible. The baby needed immediate attention, and there was no time to waste. But as the medical team worked frantically to stabilize the baby, Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away from the dog. He stood near the entrance, eyes still locked on the room, a deep sadness in his eyes that seemed almost human. It was as if he knew exactly what was happening and knew that his job was not yet done. For the next few minutes, Sarah and the rest of the team worked tirelessly, fighting to keep the baby alive. The small child was dehydrated, malnourished, and cold. But despite all the odds stacked against him, he remained alive. The doctor's voice was low but urgent as he assessed the situation. "This baby is critical," he said, glancing at the monitors. "We need to warm him up and start fluids immediately. His condition is dire." As the nurses did their best to stabilize the infant, Sarah took another glance at the dog. He hadn't moved a muscle. His eyes remained trained on the door, watching intently, waiting. There was a sense of knowing in his gaze, he wasn't just a stray. This dog had brought this baby here, and now, it seemed, he was waiting for something. "Someone should call the police," Sarah finally said, breaking the silence. "This doesn't make sense. A dog can't just show up with a baby like this." We need to find out where he came from." As one of the nurses quickly dialed the police, Sarah knelt down beside the dog. She couldn't ignore the odd, almost surreal connection between the two: Thor, the dog, and the baby. The dog's eyes never wavered from the door, even as Sarah ran her hand gently over his fur. His body was worn, but his presence was powerful, protective, almost fatherly. When the officers arrived, they too were taken aback. The story seemed impossible, but it was all too real. The police, skeptical but willing to investigate, approached the dog with caution. One officer, a tall man named Jack, took the lead. "What do we have here?" he asked, trying to maintain his professional composure despite the bizarre situation. He turned to the nurses. "Anyone tried to identify this dog?" "He's a stray, but something about him," Sarah began, her voice trailing off. She couldn't explain it. There was a calmness about the dog, an intelligence that went beyond simple instincts. The officer, Jack, knelt down beside the animal. "Hey, buddy," Jack murmured, extending a hand slowly to the dog. The dog hesitated for only a moment, then allowed Jack to clip a leash to his collar. "Take us to where you found the baby," Jack commanded softly, not expecting much from a dog that had already defied all expectations. To the officer's surprise, the dog immediately began to move, walking with determination. There was no hesitation in his steps, he knew where he was going. Jack and his team followed, amazed at the dog's purpose. Thor led them through the quiet streets, away from the center of town, into a more desolate, abandoned part of the city. The buildings grew smaller, more run down. The air felt heavier, as if the neighborhood itself had been forgotten by time. Jack's heart began to race. Something about this place was off. Finally, Thor stopped at the front of a small, dilapidated house. The front door hung ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The officers exchanged wary glances. This was the place. They couldn't explain it, but everything about this dog's actions seemed to be leading them here. Jack motioned to his team. "Let's check it out." As they moved cautiously toward the door, the mystery deepened. What was this dog's connection to the baby? How had he known to bring him here? The answer was just around the corner, and it would reveal a story no one could have anticipated. The officers hesitated only briefly before stepping into the eerie, silent house. The walls, once painted with care, were now chipped and worn, and the floor creaked under the weight of their boots. As the flashlight beams flickered through the dust-heavy air, the atmosphere was thick with neglect. The house had an abandoned feel, like the remnants of a life left behind. Thor, despite his exhaustion, moved steadily toward the back of the house. His steps were deliberate, guided by a familiarity that seemed to transcend ordinary dog behavior. His eyes were focused, unwavering. He knew exactly where he was going. The officers followed closely, exchanging nervous glances as they navigated the darkened hallways. In the far corner of the house, Thor stopped in front of a small, cluttered room. The door to the room was cracked open, and the faint smell of decay and mildew hung in the air. As the officers entered, their flashlights illuminated the worn furniture and the dust-covered floors. But then something caught their attention, something that struck them with a mixture of sadness and confusion. In one corner of the room stood an old, battered crib, the wooden slats covered in dust. A thin, tattered blanket lay over it, and around the crib, the remains of a makeshift living space could be seen: scattered bottles, a half-eaten meal that had been forgotten, and an overturned dog food bowl. Thor approached the crib slowly, his nose sniffing the air as he circled the area with a sense of urgency. "It was here," one of the officers murmured, his voice heavy with disbelief. "The baby was here." Thor moved closer to the crib, gently sniffing the space where the baby had once been. His body was now slumped with exhaustion, as if the weight of his mission had finally caught up with him. He collapsed beside the crib, his body heavy and tired, but his eyes never left the spot where the baby had once lay. "This is unbelievable," another officer whispered, stepping closer to Thor. "This dog, he wasn't just guarding the baby. He was taking care of it." The officers paused for a moment, taking in the scene before them. The signs of abandonment were all too clear. No one had been here in weeks, maybe even months. Yet, Thor had been here, faithfully guarding the baby, keeping him safe, and now, he had brought the child to the hospital. The discovery was almost too much to process. But the mystery was far from over. As the officers continued to survey the room, one of them, Officer Davis, spotted something else. A crumpled piece of paper on the dining table, partially hidden under some old newspapers. He reached over and picked it up, carefully unfolding the paper. His eyes scanned the handwritten words, and his expression darkened. "I no longer have the strength to care for him," the letter began. "Everything is falling apart around me. All I have left is Thor, and I know he will do the right thing. I hope that one day you can forgive me." The officer's voice faltered as he read aloud. "The letter isn't signed, but it's clear. This woman, she was desperate." The rest of the officers listened intently, the weight of the situation settling in. The letter wasn't long, but its words were profound. It spoke of a mother's anguish, of a woman who had run out of resources and hope. She had placed her trust in Thor, hoping that he could do what she no longer had the strength to do: save her baby. "He did it," Officer Davis murmured. "Thor saved the baby." Silence fell over the room as the officers processed what they had uncovered. The dog, who had appeared so ordinary at first glance, had taken on an extraordinary role. He had been the baby's guardian, his protector, when no one else could. His loyalty and love had driven him to act in ways that defied logic. But the question still remained: who was the woman who had written the letter? Where was she now? The officers knew that the investigation was far from over, but at least one thing was clear: Thor had done the impossible. He had kept the baby alive. As the officers continued their search of the house, Thor remained where he was, resting by the crib. His body was limp, but his spirit seemed resolute. He had done his job. The baby was safe, and his mission had been accomplished. He had done more for that child than anyone could have imagined. Minutes later, Officer Davis stood up, his eyes scanning the room. "We need to find the mother," he said. "She needs to know that her baby is safe." But as they began to leave the house, the dog stayed behind, still resting by the crib. His head was heavy with exhaustion, but his heart was filled with relief. He had done what he was meant to do. Outside the house, the night was quiet, and the officers' patrol lights cast long beams on the empty streets. But for Thor, the mission was complete. He had fulfilled his duty. Now, it was time for the baby to heal, for the mother to be found, and for the story of this extraordinary dog to begin to unfold. Back at the hospital, the team of doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize the baby. Despite the exhaustion etched on their faces, they refused to give up. Every second counted, and the tiny patient needed all the help he could get. The baby, whom they had learned was named Noah, remained in critical condition, but there was a faint flicker of hope now, thanks to Thor's timely intervention. The hospital was abuzz with activity as the medical staff fought to save this fragile life. In the emergency room, Noah was now receiving fluids and oxygen, his pale skin slowly beginning to show some signs of improvement. His heartbeat, once erratic and weak, had stabilized just enough for the doctors to allow themselves a small moment of relief. But they knew that the baby was still far from out of danger. Outside, Thor continued to wait patiently at the entrance, his body worn out from the long journey, but his spirit resolute. He had done what was needed, but something inside him told him that his work wasn't done. His eyes remained fixed on the emergency room doors, unwavering, as though waiting for the next part of the story to unfold. The dog didn't bark, didn't move, but his presence was a constant reminder of the miracle he had brought to the hospital. Meanwhile, a sense of urgency had begun to spread among the officers who had been dispatched to investigate. The clues they had uncovered in the abandoned house were troubling, and they knew they needed to find the woman who had left Noah in Thor's care. Time was running out, and the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But there were still so many questions left unanswered. One of the officers, Officer Green, stood in the hospital's waiting room, pacing restlessly. He had been on the force for many years, but he had never encountered a case like this. A dog bringing a baby to a hospital? It was absurd. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The dog, Thor, had saved the baby's life, and now they needed to find the baby's mother. Where do we even start? Officer Green muttered to himself. This whole thing doesn't make sense. The hospital doors swung open just as Officer Green was about to leave. A paramedic rushed in, followed by an elderly man who had been waiting outside for some time. The man had come forward with a piece of crucial information. He remembered seeing the baby's mother just a few months ago. The woman had always looked troubled, he explained, and often appeared with Thor by her side. He described her as a young, exhausted mother who had been clearly struggling. The man had not seen her for some time, but the information he provided was vital. She was alone, the man said softly, and she had no one. Just the dog. Thor. Officer Green's eyes widened. Thor, he repeated. That's the dog's name. The elderly man nodded slowly. Yes. Thor was her only friend, her only companion. That dog loved that baby like no one else could. The words resonated with Officer Green. It was clear now that Thor's loyalty wasn't just to the baby, it was to the woman too. He had been her protector, her constant source of comfort in her darkest hours. And now, he had done the unthinkable. He had saved the life of the child she had been unable to care for. The officer thanked the elderly man and rushed to find his team. The search for the mother had become even more urgent now, and they had a lead. Underscore 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 underscore. In a nearby park, a young woman sat alone on a bench, looking lost and confused. She was pale, disoriented, and weak. Her eyes were vacant, as if she had been wandering for days without direction. She clutched her arms tightly around her chest, as though she were trying to hold on to something, but there was nothing left to grasp. The only thing that remained was the unbearable weight of her despair. A paramedic spotted her from a distance, and upon seeing her condition, rushed over to offer assistance. "Are you okay?" the paramedic asked gently. The woman looked up, her eyes flickering with a faint recognition, but she couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, and a soft sob escaped her throat. "I'm going to take you to the hospital," the paramedic said softly. "You need help." The woman nodded weakly, her eyes blank, and she allowed herself to be helped into the ambulance. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the team had been waiting for news. They had already learned that the woman's baby was stable, but they had no idea where the mother was. Officer Green's team had continued to investigate, but they had no way of knowing where to look next. The woman was brought into the emergency room, and when she saw the officers waiting for her, a look of recognition flickered across her face. The woman was Chloe, Noah's mother. She had been lost and alone, struggling to survive in the wake of her own devastation. She had placed all her trust in Thor, and now, somehow, the dog had brought them to safety. As the officers approached, one of them asked softly, "How is your baby?" Chloe looked up, her face filled with relief and terror all at once. "He's alive?" she asked in a whisper, her voice barely audible. "Thor. He brought him here?" "Yes," Officer Green said, his voice calm but full of emotion. "Your baby is safe. Thanks to Thor." Tears welled up in Chloe's eyes as she collapsed into the officer's arms, overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude and sorrow. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I didn't know how much longer we could go on. But Thor. He took care of him. He saved him." The officers exchanged glances, their faces filled with awe at the loyalty and love Thor had shown. Chloe was escorted to Noah's room, where she finally laid eyes on her baby. The sight of him, alive and fighting, was almost too much for her to bear. She ran to his side, holding his small, fragile form in her arms as she sobbed with gratitude. And there, standing in the doorway, was Thor. His head held high, his eyes steady and filled with understanding. He had completed his mission. He had saved the baby and reunited the family. Chloe sat by Noah's bedside, her hand gently caressing his tiny head as he slept peacefully. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of hope rising in her chest. The storm of despair that had consumed her for so long was finally starting to lift. It wasn't just because her baby had made it through. It was because she wasn't alone anymore. She had Thor. The dog who had been her companion, her savior, and the guardian of her son. The loyalty and love Thor had shown her family defied all logic, and yet it had worked miracles. Thor stood quietly at the door, watching them with those intelligent eyes. His fur was matted and dirty from the long journey, but he didn't seem to mind. He had done what he needed to do. He had carried the weight of a mission that no one else could have completed. And now, with Noah safe in his mother's arms, he knew that his job was done. The hospital staff had been amazed by the dog's actions, but no one was more grateful than Chloe. She had been at her lowest point, with no support, no resources, and no hope. But then Thor had come into her life, and everything had changed. She had never realized the depth of her connection with him, but now, as she held her baby and watched Thor stand by her side, she knew she had found something truly extraordinary. In the days that followed, Chloe began to recover physically, but the emotional scars would take longer to heal. With the support of the hospital's social services team, she was given the resources she needed to start anew. She had temporary housing, food, and, most importantly, the emotional support that she had so desperately needed. For the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. And Thor never left her side. He slept at the foot of Noah's crib, always alert, always watching over them. He was the glue that held them together, the silent protector who had made all the difference. The hospital's social worker, Sarah, had seen many cases, but this one was unlike anything she had ever encountered. She had witnessed firsthand how deep the bond between a human and an animal could go. "He's not just a dog," Sarah said softly as she looked at Thor, who was resting quietly by Noah's side. "He's a hero. He saved their lives." Chloe smiled softly, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "He's my hero. He's the reason my baby is here." Thor's loyalty had shown her the true meaning of hope, and now Chloe was determined to rebuild her life for herself and for Noah. She had a long road ahead of her, but with Thor by her side, she felt a strength she had never known before. One afternoon, as Chloe sat on the couch, Noah resting in her arms, she watched as Thor lay beside them, his eyes half closed in contentment. The room was quiet, but there was a sense of peace that hadn't existed before. It was the calm after the storm, the beginning of a new chapter. "Thank you, Thor," Chloe whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving us." Thor lifted his head and wagged his tail gently, as if understanding the gravity of her words. He had done what no one else could. He had carried the baby to safety, and now, he had become part of this new family. There would be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Chloe felt confident that she could face them. The story of Thor and Noah began to spread throughout the community. People were moved by the dog's incredible loyalty and the love he had shown to the family. Donations poured in to help Chloe get back on her feet, and she was able to secure a steady job. The small, abandoned house where they had once lived was now filled with warmth and life. As the months passed, Chloe and Noah grew stronger together. She watched with pride as Noah took his first steps, wobbly but determined, always with Thor by his side. The bond between the child and the dog was unbreakable, and it was clear that their journey together had just begun. Thor had never strayed far from Noah. He was always there, walking alongside him, standing guard, offering comfort. The dog's presence brought a sense of security that Chloe had never known. No matter what the future held, she knew that they would face it together. One day, as Chloe and Noah played in the backyard, Thor stood watch, his eyes scanning the horizon. It was a peaceful moment, but it wasn't lost on Chloe how far they had come. From the darkest days of despair to this moment of calm, Thor had been the constant, the unwavering protector. He had saved Noah's life, and now he was helping them build a new future. As Noah ran towards Thor, giggling with joy, Chloe couldn't help but smile. The weight of the past still lingered, but it wasn't as heavy anymore. The future felt brighter, filled with promise. With Thor by her side, she knew that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other. "Come on, Thor," Chloe called, her voice full of warmth and love. "Let's make sure Noah stays out of trouble." Thor's tail wagged in response as he bounded toward them, his ears perked and his eyes full of energy. He was more than just a dog, he was family. And this family was finally whole again, thanks to the hero who had walked into the hospital that night, carrying a baby in his mouth, and forever changed their lives. Chloe held Noah in her arms as Thor stood by her side, his gaze steady, always watchful. Together, they had overcome the impossible. Together, they had found hope. And together, they would face whatever came next. The story of Thor and the baby would continue to inspire others, reminding them that sometimes, real heroes don't wear capes. They have 4 legs and a heart full of love. The story of Thor, the loyal dog who saved a baby's life, carries a profound lesson about love, loyalty, and the extraordinary impact that a deep bond can have on our lives. Thor's devotion to the baby and his mother, Chloe, exemplifies how sometimes the most powerful forces of protection and care come from unexpected places. This story reminds us that love transcends species, and true heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they have 4 legs and a heart bigger than we can imagine. In real life, we often face overwhelming challenges where the path forward seems unclear or impossible. Thor's actions remind us of the importance of resilience, compassion, and the courage to keep going when things seem hopeless. In difficult times, we may find support in unexpected forms, whether from people or animals, and these bonds can provide the strength we need to survive and thrive. The story emphasizes that, just as Thor protected the baby and helped rebuild the family, our own acts of kindness, loyalty, and support can make an incredible difference in the lives of others. It calls us to value the connections we share and to step forward, just as Thor did, when someone needs help the most.